In this Elden Ring video, we're going to be taking a look at the 15 best intelligence builds in Elden Ring, and combined with Shadow of the Erdtree, we'll also be adding Shadow of the Erdtree builds to this video. This is another video in our series where we kind of take a look at some of the builds I have made over the time that Elden Ring has been out, kind of isolate the best ones and kind of show you, how to play a good intelligence build and the different play styles available to intelligence builds, and show you that they're not just all spellcasting, right? Like you can make hybrids and melee builds that use intelligence. So as usual, we'll start with the level 50 builds first. This is kind of the point of the game where you really start to put the build together. Much before this, you're kind of scrambling a bit. You don't have the levels to really use a lot of weapons, and you're just kind of trying to sort yourself out. So at level 50, the first build that we're going to talk about is the Moonveil Samurai. Now, we just did a video on this recently, the Moonveil Resurrected build, and I'll go into that build later. That is a level 150 plus version of this build. But level 50 is about the very beginning of the game where you can really use the Moonveil weapon, and that's because it does have significant stat requirements that are going to require some levels to invest in order to use this weapon well. You need 12 strength, 18 dexterity, and 23 intelligence in order to use this weapon effectively. And if you meet all the requirements for that, then you're still going to need points in vigor, you're still going to need points in mind, still going to need points in endurance, etc. So really you're looking at probably no earlier than 50 are you going to use this weapon. So originally we sort of used this weapon to stance break bosses very, very quickly with the stance damage from Transient Moonlight using the heavy attack. But now you're sort of going to play this build for damage and also some stance breaks, although it'll take you longer to stance break. But you're going to be focusing on the amount of damage that you're doing from the wave, which means that you're going to be cranking intelligence to get the most of your wave damage, focusing on things that increase your magic damage in order to get most damage out of that wave, because it's 100% magic damage. And you can still absolutely wreck bosses and enemies with this playstyle, and you can still stagger regular enemies very easily using Transient Moonlight, which allows you to recover your FP if you use something like the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger, and to continue to use that as you make your way through the game. Next up, we're going to take a look at the Spellsword build. This is actually an all-game build that you can use throughout the entire game. But essentially what this build does is it focuses on the use of the Ash of War Glintblade Phalanx and the stance damage that does in combined with a greatsword. In this case, I've used the Claymore, but you could theoretically use any greatsword that you want. And when you hit enemies with the projectiles from Glintblade Phalanx and then the follow-up attack with a greatsword, you will still deal over 40 stance damage. I think it's 42 stance damage exactly to bosses. And this allows you to stance break a lot of bosses in 2 attacks with this setup, assuming that all projectiles hit and you hit with the follow-up. Most bosses have 80 stance, some have more than that. You might have to do it 3 times. But generally speaking, you should be able to stance break at least half the bosses in the game with this combination. We also buff our weapon with Scholar's Armament in order to increase its damage. So this is actually a split attribute build using strength and intelligence on the Claymore. But you could, again, pick any other greatsword that you want and go Dex Intelligence if you prefer. But this strategy is still the same. And this is kind of a modification to the Magus build that I made. And back in the day, the Glintblade Phalanx weapon skill actually did far more stance damage than it does now. And so you wanted a weapon with higher crit rating like the Rapier, which is what we used in that build, for a lot of high crit damage when you would go in for that critical hit. But now it's more important to get the stance break, particularly on bosses, than it is for that critical damage, because it's much harder to get enough stance damage using a Rapier, although you could still if you wanted, and it's easier using a greatsword, which is why we do it here. And the last level 50 build that's also an all-game build is the Carian Cleaver build. This is a build that uses the Iron Cleaver set to the Magic Infusion, which happens to be very, very good with this weapon. And it uses its charged heavy attack to absolutely brutalize enemies and bosses. So the general strategy for this build is to lean into the charged heavy attack of the Iron Cleaver, which is fantastic. It starts off at range and kind of charges in and swings, which allows you to start the charged heavy attack from a safe distance and then come in range for very good damage. So you're going to buff with Royal Knight's Resolve, and buff with the Jellyfish Shield's Contagious Fury skill, and you're going to use things like the Axe Talisman, you're going to use things like the Spike Crack Tier, Brittle Sword Talisman, Magic Scorpion Charm, and Magic Shroud and Crack Tier to buff your damage even more, so that when you go in for that charged heavy attack, you absolutely slaughter whatever you're attacking. And you can 2-shot a lot of bosses with this build, and a lot of difficult enemies you can 1-shot. So it works very, very effectively, and it's just a build that focuses around charged heavy attacks. And one of the things I really like about it is it's just so quick to kill things, it's absolutely devastating. And you can also get an Iron Cleaver so early on in the game that you can put this build together very, very quickly. So moving on to level 100 builds, the first build we'll take a look at is the Crystal Mage build. This is a build that focuses on using the crystal sorceries and using the crystal staff in order to further boost the damage of those sorceries. And again, with this build, you're going to lean into crystal sorceries like Crystal Torrent and Shattering Crystal. These can be absolutely devastating if used properly. And because you're at a point of the game where your intelligence is not going to be like 70, 80, you're not going to be using the Carian Regal Scepter here. And as you go higher, if you played this build higher, you would probably cast with the Carian Regal Scepter and keep this in your offhand if you wanted to make like a similar build at higher levels. But because we're at this point of the game where you probably have 50, 60 intelligence, something like that, you're going to actually have better sorcery scaling with the Crystal Staff at this point. So you don't need to carry an extra staff around for this build. And Shattering Crystal is like a really good shotgun spell that can hit over a wide area. So if you're having trouble hitting an enemy, it's really good. And Crystal Torrent is a spell that you can just hold down. You'll have seen this in other build videos we do, that you can just unload it into bosses and deal lots of damage in a hurry. These are, of course, not the only spells you can use. You'll still use like Glintstone Pebble or Great Glintstone Shard for like a regular ranged attack. You might use something like Comet or Terra Magica as well. But you're going to be focusing on using those two spells for the bulk of like boss fights. Next is the Darkmoon Spellblade, which is a build that focuses on using the Darkmoon Greatsword. And I think this is probably the earliest level-ish that you would probably use the Darkmoon Greatsword, and that's primarily because you don't get it until very far into the game by progressing a storyline, so you're not really going to have access to this weapon pretty early in the game at lower levels unless someone drops it for you. So I made this build focused for this part of the game, which would be about the level you get when you get this weapon. So the Darkmoon Spellblade is another build that focuses on stance breaks by buffing the Darkmoon Greatsword and using its waves to stance break enemies at range. You also use the Great Blade Phalanx spell to help with stance damage, so you can cast this up and then start firing your waves into bosses and staggering them. If you're point blank, obviously you're going to do more stance damage than if you hit at range or if you connect with the weapon and the projectile. But what you're really going for is using that projectile at range not only to deal damage, but also to stance break bosses. And it's super, super effective, particularly when you combine it with Great Blade Phalanx. This is arguably one of my favorite weapons in the game. It looks cool, it feels cool, and it absolutely stance breaks the hell out of things. Next up is the Frost Knight build, which is easily one of my favorite builds I've ever put together. It's super effective and super easy to use. So this build uses the Clayman's Harpoon. This is an S tier weapon in Elden Ring, easily one of the best weapons. It does physical and magic damage. It can still be infusible, which is great. And it allows you to go a few different ways with it. But what I've done in this build is I've used the Cold Infusion and selected the Ice Spear Ash of War. Now what Ice Spear does is it's kind of a magic damage projectile that'll launch a decent range, and it will deal magic damage to the target. It'll deal stance damage to the target, 25 stance damage, which is pretty good at range. And it will also build up Frostbite on the target at range. So you can get Frostbite on any enemy that can very easily, and you'll apply Frostbite with your melee attacks due to the Cold Infusion as well. And on top of that, you can turtle behind a shield in order to block and poke at the same time using this spear, and then use the ranged option of Ice Spear when you need a ranged option, where like maybe there's two enemies coming at you, you need to take one out real quick, you can do that. Or maybe you just want to attack a boss safely from a distance, build up some stance damage, and then go in and attack. These are really great options, and this build has very good flexibility because of that, and it's highly, highly successful and very easy to use. And then the last 100 build we're going to take a look at is the Moonveil Shinobi build. This is another build that uses Moonveil. This is kind of an advancement of the Samurai build, but what we've done with this build that's slightly different is we've put a cold-infused Uchigatana in the offhand, because the Uchigatana is about the same length as Moonveil in terms of, how far it can reach. So when you're attacking with a dual-wield setup, you're not swinging away with one weapon that's way longer or way shorter than the other and missing half your attacks. So it's very, very similar, and the Cold Infusion has similar scaling to Moonveil in terms of, mixture of physical and intelligence damage, or magic damage rather. And so we've done it that way. And what this allows you to do is when you stance break something using Moonveil, you, instead of going in for that critical attack, you can just wail away using your dual wield combo, or you can do your wield combo, depending on what's happening in a fight. And it just gives you a little bit more options. You can still attack with Moonveil using its weapon skill, or you can dual wield, build up some frostbite on an enemy. It's just a bit of a different pivot for the Moonveil weapon, whereas most people are leaning into its Ash of War. This kind of gives you more flexibility to dual wield. Okay, moving along to level 150 builds. First up is the Meteor Mage build. This is another mage build, shocking. that focuses on using meteor spells. And at this point in the game, you're going to be casting with Carian Regal Scepter to get very good sorcery scaling, and you're going to be using the Meteor Staff or Meteorite Staff in your offhand for the boost to gravity damage spells. But we're going to be focusing on using those spells exclusively in this build. It's kind of a theme mage build. You can obviously add other spells in that you want. But something really interesting about the meteor spells is that some of them do physical damage, some do magic damage, and some do a mixture of physical and magic damage. So it's something to take into consideration, and something that makes this build quite effective, because if a boss is resistant to magic damage, for instance, you can use the physical damage spells, or vice versa. So it's really good, really fun to play, and not too many people, I think, are aware of how good these spells can actually be. And one of the reasons that it's so late into the game is that it takes you a while to gather all of the spells for this build, because you have to kill some late game bosses in order to get some of them. So next is the Nebula Knight build, and this is a build that uses the Wing of Astal curved sword and a shield in order to kind of have like a, tanky type playstyle that block counters and attacks, but that also can use Nebula when needed to absolutely wreck tough to kill enemies and bosses. Nebula kind of shoots out a cluster of like stars, for instance, out in front of you that deal magic damage when they explode, and they kind of fan out. But when you use these in a tight area, they ball up and they all hit the target for very, very high damage. Or if you're fighting a target that has a huge body mass, these will all hit that target, dealing a lot of damage. And they can deal stance damage as well. So it's not only good damage from the weapon, but each detonation deals 13 stance damage. So you can get like a lot of stance damage on a boss. Next, we come to the Royal Knight, or Royal Frost Knight, and this is kind of an advancement of the Frost Knight build, where we still use a shield and spear using the Clayman's Harpoon, but we've also added the Royal Greatsword weapon into the mix as an alternate weapon to use for this build. And the Royal Greatsword is actually a colossal sword. It's not a greatsword at all, even though it's named that. And what we really are using this weapon for is the fact that it not only deals physical and magic damage, but it also has a weapon skill called Wolf's Assault that does very, very high damage, and it does it in AoE, allowing you to like take out multiple enemies in one explosion, and can also do frostbite buildup as well when using that weapon skill. So this kind of gives you an AoE option with that weapon skill, or you can use Ice Spear to kind of, maybe pick off some targets at range. It gives you a little bit more flexibility. And lastly, for 150 builds, we come to the Moonlight Crusader. This is another build that uses the Darkmoon Greatsword. It's kind of an advancement of this build, but it also uses the Carian Regal Scepter for casting. So we have very high intelligence for this build. That's going to further boost the wave damage from Darkmoon Greatsword when using Moonlight Greatsword's projectiles with heavy attacks, charged heavy attacks, and allow you to cast spells. But one of the great things, too, is at this point, you'll have access to Ranni's Darkmoon. You can cast the spell into bosses for very high magic damage. And sometimes it will trigger Frostbite as well, further debuffing them and allowing you to deal more damage to them with your waves. So it's a nice combination, and this kind of fulfills like everything that you would want to do with the Darkmoon Greatsword. And it's just kind of like at a level 100, you're just kind of barely able to get it and use it. And at this level, you're kind of really coming into your own with that build. So next we come to level 150 plus builds. These are builds that you would probably play in New Game Plus or maybe the DLC. And the first one is kind of one that I made just before the DLC came out. It's called Spell Thief. And this is a build that uses the Glintstone Chris dagger, and it uses a shield. And it doesn't really do a ton of spell casting, but really just leans into the weapon skill of the Glintstone Chris, called Glintstone Dart. Now, Glintstone Dart operates very similarly to Glintstone Pebble if you're familiar with that weapon skill at all. This basically allows you to cast a magic projectile that has a short to medium-ish range, and then follow up with a thrust attack that kind of slides into the enemy for damage. The advantage of Glintstone Dart versus Glintstone Pebble, though, is that it goes through the target and can hit multiple targets behind it. It does a little bit more damage, costs a little bit more FP, but does a little bit more damage, and you can charge it for even more damage if you want. And why that's so important is that it can let you hit multiple enemies, and it can also let you one-shot most enemies in one cast. The downside of Glintstone Pebble is that you almost always have to hit with a follow-up attack in order to defeat an enemy. But when you use Glintstone Dart, you can just kill them with the projectile portion by charging it up, using things like Godfrey Icon or Ritual Sword Talisman when you're at full health, Magic, Scorpion Charm, etc., and just stay out of harm's way and just range down enemies from afar. It's basically life on easy mode once you have this weapon skill, and it's one of the easiest builds in the game to use. The downside is that you won't get this weapon until very, very late into the game, so it's pretty much a New Game Plus weapon. So next up is the Gravity Sorcerer build, and this is a Shadow of the Erdtree build that I made really recently, and it's kind of like the 2.0 version of the Meteor Mage, if you will. You're still using a lot of gravity spells, you're casting with Carian Regal Scepter and holding Meteorite Staff in your offhand in order to increase the damage of those spells, but you're adding in 2 new spells that you get in the DLC, Gravitational Missile and Blades of Stone. Gravitational Missile kind of throws out a magic orb that pulls in enemies and deals damage to them and explodes for a lot of damage, tends to knock down enemies. And it deals magic damage, which, if you need magic damage, is great. And if you cast this on an unsuspecting enemy from the distance, they're pretty much toast. Harder to use on like aggressive enemies that are close range, but one of the great things about it is you can just fling it point blank into the ground and it'll detonate and usually just kill everything right around you, which is fantastic. And Blades of Stone, you can use at range. It deals physical damage and kind of throws up like rock blades from under the ground that hit the target repeatedly and deals a significant amount of damage. And again, it's physical damage, so if a boss is resistant to magic, this can be great. And its tracking is really good. It's very easy to kill bosses at safe range with this if you can create separation. And because it does physical damage, you can buff with like Flame Grant Me Strength or use Exalted Flesh to get more damage out of it. And it just works really, really well. And adding those 2 spells into that Meteor Mage build gives you a better repertoire of spells and just makes you super effective. Next, we have the Carian Knight build, which is another Shadow of the Erdtree build, and this is a build that uses the Carian Sorcery Sword, and the claim to fame of this weapon is that it allows you to cast spells with a heavy attack, and so you can cast spells with a shield in your offhand, block counter with the weapon, and then cast spells with the heavy attack when you need, spell casting. And this is really good for people that have trouble swapping back and forth between their staff and shield in combat when bosses are all over them, like myself. And it's just really fun to play, in my opinion. It kind of gives you the best of a Spellsword and an Enchanted Knight type build together, because you can just play a sword and shield setup while casting spells at the same time. And this build actually uses a new spell that I really love called Rolana's Twin Moons that does significant magic damage, and it's kind of a fantastic AoE. And what I really love about this spell is it's great for groups, it's great on bosses, but it was also buffed really recently in patch 1.14. And now it has hyper armor, so you can use it more effectively when surrounded by enemies or like right up in the face of a boss. And lastly, we come to Moonveil Resurrected, which is a new version of the Moonveil build and probably how pretty much anyone who uses Moonveil now will use it. And again, that's leaning into the wave damage. And by adding Rolana's Cameo, the talisman, the new talisman from the DLC to this build that was recently buffed in patch 1.14, it effectively allows you to charge the attack before you use it for like 1 second and get substantial increase to damage, making the waves hit like a truck. And I think I first tried just about every boss I used with Moonveil, the Moonveil Resurrected build, because even without stance breaks, it's just so good. And then when you get a stance break here and there on top of it, it's even better. But you definitely want to use Rolana's Cameo when using that weapon skill now. It's just so good with it. So that wraps up my top 15 intelligent builds for Elden Ring, showcasing some of the builds that I've made. There are a lot more intelligent builds I've made, but these are the best of the best, I think, of what can still successfully run the game and still what handle really well to this day. As always, if you guys have further comments about builds or questions about them, please let me know in the comments below.